All right, hi everyone. Before we go on, I forgot about this comparison, and I wanted to point us back to our chapter on Japanese art because, of course, we've seen a version of Manet's Olympia before. In Morimura's reworking and reimagining of this piece in his work entitled Futago or Twin from 1988. Does that sound right? And we're going to we see how Futago plays with gender roles, um, um, ethnic identities, and also the formation of the self here, because of course Morimura is both Olympia and the African servant who is bringing in flowers here from a possible client in the background. And so this is a fantastic example of how Olympia really lives on as a hugely influential work in the 20th and 21st centuries. Okay, let's skip ahead here to Impressionism. The Impressionists are the first group to really break away from the Salon. The Realists, they're still showing at the Salon in different ways. The Impressionists, they create their own exhibitions. In 1874, they start to have their own shows, similar to the kind of gallery dealer system today that's so ingrained into our notion of art making, but was an important innovation then. Impressionists sought individual freedom, self-determinacy, and the pleasure of the senses, with little larger historical ambition and none of the kind of political attack of a Courbet or a Manet. They're interested in creating a sensory experience, and I think we can really see that here in Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise. This is the painting that gave this movement its name. It was shown at the first of 8 Impressionist exhibitions, and we see typical elements of Impressionist form. So these pure, bright colors that are juxtaposed, they're side by side, they are not blended, and that eliminates the kind of crisp contour lines that we're used to in highly naturalistic painting. The Impressionists achieved these bright colors because the canvas was primed in white. And since the Renaissance, the more typical was for canvases to be primed in a kind of dark reddish brown. The content of this work is also typical of the Impressionists. They're interested in these dramatic moments that are fleeting. A sunrise. Think about a sunrise where the colors, the lighting effects are constantly changing. And the Impressionists are very influenced by photography in this regard. This idea of capturing this kind of split second, this moment in time. It's so easy for us to forget how controversial the Impressionists were when they were first shown because, of course, we're used to looking at Impressionist work. It's all over on posters and t-shirts, umbrellas, whatever else. But if you're used to looking at Ingres or David, think about trying to make sense of this new radical work. In fact, a lot of critics said this feels unfinished. It almost feels like these are artists who are trying to swindle the public, pass off a kind of half-assed work that is not really a monumental painting. Another thing the Impressionists did that was so different is they took their work out of the studio. And this is what we know today as plein air or open air painting. And for those of you who have worked outside, you know all the challenges that this brings, the changing lighting effects, the wind, the way colors look with different light, the fact that your scene is not this kind of controlled thing that you set up in your studio, but it can change, it can look different all the time. But of course, this was so important to the Impressionists because they wanted to capture these fleeting moments, this sense of life, this sense of dynamism and energy in their work. Another thing that helped them paint in open air is the development of the pliable paint tube in 1841. Um, Artists didn't have to mix all of their paints themselves, and that seems like a simple thing, but very crucial. Here we see Manet painting his friend Monet, who enjoyed working in his floating studio, essentially working in his rowboat. The Impressionists show us scenes of this kind of carefree modern life. Again, none of that biting critique of Courbet, but instead we see scenes of well-to-do Parisians enjoying themselves in parks. This is a very popular place is called the Frog Pond, and it's a floating restaurant and dance hall in an urban park in Paris. This is the same location for Renoir's luncheon of the boating party. And that's also typical that the Impressionists often went and worked together in different places. Now, that was a different story for the women, because women were not allowed to leave their house without a male relative, without a chaperone. That was considered lewd behavior for women at this time. And so the female members of the Impressionist group, we see domestic interior scenes. That's what they knew. That's what was available to them. And here in Mary Cassatt's Woman Bathing, we see the kind of flattening of the color and the space that's typical of Impressionism. And this work is highly influenced by Japanese ukiyo-e prints, these Japanese woodblocks that we also talked about a few weeks ago. And you can see how Cassatt, she is looking at these Japanese wood blocks that are becoming so popular in Europe at the time. The Europeans can't get enough. And we see a very similar domestic scene from Kiyonaga's Two Women at the Bath, looking in at this kind of unstaged, spontaneous, slice of life domestic moment. All right, let's take a look at Manet's kind of final late career big artistic statement. And I think this is where we get to see a little bit of, all these scenes of leisure, people out enjoying themselves, doing things that seem and that we know are not things that we can enjoy right now. But we see that slowly, this kind of carefree optimism, this happy-go-lucky approach, it just can't last for long. And Manet, really at the end of his career, he calls for a return to monumentality and a profundity of meaning in painting. This has to do with the political and the financial context of the time. There's an economic recession in the 1880s in Europe. So this idea of kind of all the leisure, spending your money and time at bars, at concerts, at dance halls, it just doesn't really match what people are doing anymore. And here we see this barmaid who seems so disaffected, so unhappy. She is standing at the bar where we see all of these different consumer products. And this is also something Manet is commenting on for us too, the idea of mass consumerism just not being fulfilling, not being meaningful. It almost feels like she is another consumer product here aligned on this bar. And in fact, when we look at the mirror behind the bar, we see a reflection in that mirror that we see that she is actually interacting with a gentleman here, this customer. And the implication is that it's not just the bottle of wine, the beer that's for sale here, but that she is also soliciting herself. And we know that from historical documents that women often had to supplement their income in Paris at this time by through prostitution. I think we get a real difference in tone between these two works. When we juxtapose them, we have Renoir's Luncheon, we have Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergeret here. They're not really separated by that much time, but we have two very different moods, two very different images of modern leisure in both of these works. All right. So this is another work from the same time period, but I'm gonna leave it for the end when we talk about the Baudelaire text you've read for this week and the idea of the flaneur. And so we're going to circle back to this work at the end. All right, post-impressionism. This builds on this idea of that modern life is alienating. We all know this, right? Modern life isn't all it's cracked up to be. We're sold. We're kind of, we have this kind of mass marketing that we should all just kind of be, happy and look amazing and drink a bunch of green juice and spend all this time, out and about. But we've seen this view of society dissolve before our eyes in the past few weeks. And a lot of this, just as our own society has changed, is due to the socio-historical context of the 1880s. We see huge social issues with the growth of cities, terrible working conditions, terrible living conditions, economic downturn. And I think nothing encapsulates this better than Georges Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of Le Grand Jatte. Again, another leisure setting, a park setting, but so different. We see all of these individual people who are isolated. They're not actually interacting with each other. They're together but alone. And let's see, do I have it here? If you know the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, well, let me back up. If you don't know that movie, you should. But this painting is this great kind of existential moment in the movie where Cameron stares at it. It's at and we get closer and closer to the painting to see that that crying girl who's right in the center. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago too. If we all have a chance to go to museums again. And we see that there's also a new approach to painting, and I think we see that best in the preparatory works. This is called pointillism. Seurat was interested in optics and science. He was interested in how our brains understand color and their relationship to each other. It's very different than the Impressionists, who are working plein air, outside, quickly putting these big, unblended, very visible brushstrokes on the canvas. Pointillism is very precise. These tiny little dots of pigment side by side to create this huge, all-consuming canvas.